All right. Well, today we have a special edition of ICommunicate, and I got to tell everybody, I am fired up for this because this is a guy that's going to be on the show today who I started to follow on LinkedIn. I don't even remember. I think Ben, your blog, The Thoughtful Leader, someone else must have shared it or something because we weren't originally connected.
No, that's right.
So I don't
I think it
remember,
was
but
just the
go ahead.
magic of Google, I think. Just the
Yeah.
magic of Google. Yeah.
So anyway,
I think
so
that's
here's
how you
this
got in
guy,
touch.
Ben, and let him introduce himself in a second. I got to give some pleasantries his way though first. So, I see this guy, and I just want to tell everybody, I can't be more sincere when I say this, okay? I'm like what's the word I'm looking for? Resistant when I read other people's stuff. When I read blogs and thought leaders and stuff, I almost expect it to be bad because it's like I see so much lazy and generic content on LinkedIn. And then not only that, but when something's a little longer, since no one has an attention span anymore, people are even more skeptical. Like, I'm going to really read this, whatever. So I stumble upon Ben's Thought Leader blog. And first one I ever read, I was like, this is amazing. Like, who is this guy? Like, this is amazing. And so I'm like, all right, well, maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it was just one good one. But then I'm like, okay, I'm going to connect with him and I'm going to follow. And I just want our audience to realize Ben is, when I talk about someone who adds value to their customer base, when I talk about someone who adds value to their followers, this is a guy that if I lived in Australia with him, I'd want to hang out with this guy. So Ben, without further ado, welcome to the show and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I appreciate the kind words. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and leadership development let's call myself a practitioner. So I do leadership training. Started off, as Mark mentioned, with the Thoughtful Leader blog. So this was, 8 or 9 years ago now. Wow. I started writing that with no idea of anywhere where it was going. So my background is, I actually started off working in software development a long time ago. Then moved into middle management roles and consulting for some of the big consulting firms, and then jumped out into a lot of project management and further middle management roles. So about 15, 16 years of leadership experience, and just developed a passion, particularly during consulting, for leadership, helping leaders be better or at least solve their challenges. So there's a lot of good leaders out there that are, especially the thoughtful leader ones that I classify as thoughtful leaders in that category. There's a certain set of challenges that thoughtful leaders seem to have that other leaders may not. And I think that's where I help them try to overcome those challenges. Yeah.
Ben, I got a two-part question follow-up for you. Are you, first of all, you're based in Australia. Are there, in the United States, it's very saturated, the amount of coaches and trainers and consultants. So part one of my question is it saturated in Australia? And part two is, where does the entrepreneurial spirit come from for you?
In Australia, I would say it is saturated, but I still think it is, definitely. But particularly for me, throughout my consulting career, I just had the opportunity to work with so many clients and met so many people that I've been able to build some pretty good networks. So that's helped me because I've only really been out on my own the last couple of years, and that's helped me, build some work up that way. It is saturated for sure, I would say. And the second part of your question, can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, so the entrepreneurial spirit, because I think, and I just want to add one comment before you respond. The thing about an entrepreneur is, I think people underestimate, it really takes a lot of courage, right? You really have to believe in yourself and your value and be able to take a risk. So yeah, did you just wake up one morning and say, no, I'm going to start my own business? Like, where did that all come from?
It built up slowly. I guess I've done it the safe way, right? Which is 8 or 9 years writing a blog, which is not, that wasn't my plan. I'm gonna work on this for 8 years and then I'll have my own business. It just sort of evolved that way because I was doing my day job at the same time, and then I was writing articles for Thoughtful Leader. So I think for me, it's interesting because we did we were talking about it in a recent call. We did that print assessment,
Yes.
which is about your underlying motivations. And yours and mine are very different, actually. You're much more the let's say the goal focused type of person. Go hit the target. Let's go high energy. And I'm more the safe and secure, peace and harmony, sort of laid back and get planned, like to be prepared, like to have a routine, all that sort of stuff. So sometimes it surprises me when that I have jumped out and started my own business. But I think what's done it is I look at the alternative of not starting my own business and not feeling fulfilled in what I'm doing so much, and feeling like I'm not adding as much value as I could. And then I think, well, that's a terrible place to be. So let's get going and do some work with leaders and try to help them improve. Because I think, I've obviously worked in leadership roles myself for quite a long time, but I feel like I'm much more motivated to help other leaders and help people improve than I am actually in organizations doing a small individual leadership role. I would much rather be having a bigger impact. And I think I'm able to do that through this platform.
Ben, when you think of over the course of your career and as you've continued to expand and develop on your expertise, what is it that you think you've figured out over time that makes you a good coach? Is there a secret ingredient that you think separates you from the standard coach?
I think it's I think personally it's my motivation. So the thing that motivates me is helping other people in that space. So for example, this is something I always found quite funny because I do a lot of project management work in the past, and I'm a good project manager because I care about the stakeholders and I communicate effectively and I make sure people know what's going on. But I'm certainly not someone who's running around looking at my project plan. We've got to hit that deadline and oh my goodness, and really focused on that target. So I found out sort of, in the last 5 years or so that my motivation really comes from helping the people work together effectively to achieve something, as opposed to me focusing really on the end goal so much myself. I'm less focused on achieving the goal, like I'm less motivated by that. I'm more motivated by the people working in a good way and having success themselves. So that's when it sort of lends itself to coaching, I think. And I think another thing, someone mentioned to me the other day, I was coaching someone and it was the first call, discovery call with them. And they said, oh, you've got a really good coaching approach. You have a real sort of coaching style, which is a funny thing to say because if you're coaching, you should have a coaching style.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
But she's in human resources, quite high up in an organization, and she sees a lot of different coaches. And she said a lot of them actually still try to solve the problem and try to tell you what the solution could be and all those sorts of things. Whereas I think I've become much better at just sitting back and almost, this isn't my problem we're solving here, it's the client's problem, and they have to take ownership of that. And knowing that makes a huge difference, because once you stop trying to take ownership of solving the client's problem for them, they tend to get better results because they step back and they start to have good opportunity to think through things properly. And then when you develop actions, they start taking ownership of those and they start working towards them. So I think that's what differentiates me. And over the last couple of years, I've started to notice that there are different types of coaches out there that, because the market is so saturated in the coaching space, I think we're seeing the huge spectrum of great coaches and not so great coaches. And you're seeing, obviously, if you had a bell curve, you probably got in the middle with the average ones. I'm hoping I'm up there at the good end, but who knows?
It's funny, Ben. We've had conversations in the past about what you just spoke about, the good coaches are really developing the critical thinking and problem solving skills, right, in their clients, right? And, I'm wondering, I find a lot of times when I work with executives, there's a level of impatience and a level of instant gratification that, hey, I've got an hour to have a coaching session with you, and we're going to meet every 2 weeks, hypothetically. And so just tell me the answer. Like, because I got problems in my company and I just need to know how to fix them. And, I do a lot of work, on the spectrum of conversational and emotional intelligence. So I'm curious, do you experience that need for instant gratification? And when you run into clients that are impatient and just want the answer, how do you encounter that? Like, how do you approach those situations?
Yeah, it's a common thing, I think, and I'm sort of lucky in some ways, because what I realized a couple of years ago was that the people coming to my website, contacting me through my content and getting to know me through what I write and podcasts and things, are those that are sort of on that thoughtful side of leadership. I tend to get less of the alpha style leader who's focused on being, I want to earn $2 million a year or whatever it is. Less of that and more of the people that are really focused on people, on their people. As a result of that, I think most of the clients I get, I would say, appreciate the coaching approach, because they get to sit with someone and think through their challenges and use me as a sounding board as well. But I make it pretty clear up front that advice is not the thing. Like, I can give advice and sometimes I will. There's no hard and fast rule. But if I do that, I'll usually ask permission for that advice. So, and the one thing I explain to people is, I can give you advice and tell you what to do, but you will always know your situation, your organization better than I do. So, and the other thing that is a problem is that the people will take no ownership if I give them advice and tell them what to do. So if I say to you, Mark, you should go and do this thing with your training organization, you'll say, well, okay, cool, I'll try it. So Mark goes away and tries it. Doesn't work. He goes, well, that was bad advice. If it does work, you go, oh yeah, well, that wasn't me, that was the coach telling me to do that. So they're missing an opportunity there to build their own confidence by developing their own actions, taking ownership. But if I do encounter the impatience, I think, I explain all these things, and then I think, I think the best way to do it is to actually say, look, we're going to do actual coaching here. I'm not going to give you advice, and actually give them the experience of coaching. And when people have a chance to spend an hour, hour and a half, whatever it is, in one of these proper coaching conversations, a lot of the time they'll just realize, oh, that's how this works. Because at the start, you think it would be much quicker just to give you advice, right? But that ownership is super important. If the client can't take ownership of what they're doing or building their own actions, sort of shaping their own destiny, let's call it, then they won't build that confidence, because they're always relying on someone else to do things for them.
Ben, let's talk about Australia for a second. So, we joked about this, I think, on our first call. When I've never been to Australia, I know very little about Australia, but when I think of a quote unquote Australian, okay, I think of someone who's cheery disposition, not super, talk about stereotypes, right? Not super intense type A, a little more relaxed. So this is a guess, right? Like I don't even know where I get that from, but point being is, if you've worked with people, American businessmen and women, you've worked with Australian businessmen and women, is there a difference? Are there characteristics that differentiate the way we look at business as opposed to the way Australians look at business? Or is it just, it depends who you're talking to, regardless of where you are?
I think there are broad sweeping judgments that I would make as well from the American side. But I think this is the thing. When I work with my clients, they gravitate towards me for the reason that I'm writing about thoughtful leadership and all those sorts of things. So when I work with people in the US, I haven't found them to be much different, to be honest. A lot of them are laid back. They're still having challenges, obviously. What I've noticed is that I think the pace in the US of corporate, business is still higher in the US in terms of work-life balance and all those sorts of things. It's almost like Australia on steroids, I think. There's still a lot of people working long hours, the higher workloads. Not so much in Australia. We get actually more leave as well. I think in general, as a standard, let's say you get 4 weeks of leave a year. In the US, I think it's 2. So there's things like that which I do notice. But if you look at one thing I was interested in with the US was, I don't know if you come across Hofstadter's cultural dimensions, these these things that define. It's a lot of research done over the last 30, 40 years by a guy called Hofstadter, who he tried to look at, okay, the different cultures around the world and what are the characteristics of them. And Australia and US are very similar. Like if you look at the results, they're sort of high individualistic culture, quite a bit of extroversion in the community. What were the other ones? Fairly low power distance in terms of, do I respect my leaders or do I feel comfortable challenging them? And Australia and US in all these things are so similar. There's really not much different.
Wow.
And then, things like China, for example, or Japan, really different because they've got huge respect for their leaders, very resistant to pushing back on them and that sort of stuff. So that's where there's huge differences. And that's as a culture as a whole, right? You can't really say this individual person is the same way as that culture. You're dealing with individuals, but it's just a guideline. And it was to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I reckon it's pretty similar. Yeah.
So Ben, I got to ask you, have you ever heard of the comedian George Carlin?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever listened to any of his stuff?
I haven't.
Okay.
No.
So George Carlin, there's actually a documentary right now. It's not on Netflix. I think it was on HBO or Showtime, and in the States. And he was a pioneer comedian in the 70s and 80s, and he was very big on word choice. Like he did a lot of comedy on words and the meaning of words and how they can be taken wrong and so on and so forth. And when I talk to you, well, I'm very big on word choice. So I like to get in conversations with people about words that could have multiple meanings: respect, trust, loyalty, integrity, like all these words that are so broad, right? And so where I'm going with this is the word thoughtful. And this is one of the reasons that attracted me to you as a person, to you as a professional, and to your blog, because if I was to think of, so I'm going to be a little corny here for a second, Ben, right? So if I was to think of a characteristic, a universal characteristic of someone I would want in my life as a colleague, as a friend, as a family member, as a life partner, thoughtful may be the word I would start with, right? Like who wouldn't want to be around a thoughtful person? But I guess where I want to start with you on this is, when you say the word thoughtful, like expand on it a little bit, like, because thoughtful has a lot of components to it. So what are you shooting for? If you coached me, okay, and you said, Mark, I want you to be thoughtful, or I hope you'll become more thoughtful, meaning what?
So meaning leading, let's say if it's in a leadership context, leading with intention. And what I mean by that is being intentional about what you're doing, and to expand on that further, thinking about the impact your leadership is having on the people around you, whether it be your boss, your team, colleagues, whatever it is, customers. That's what it comes down to, really. It's that intention. So the reason I came up with that years ago and decided to make it, my blog name was, I just saw, especially in my consulting career, I got exposed to a lot of different work environments and high pressure situations. And I just noticed all this, what I sort of call unintentional leadership happening, where people were just blundering into situations with teams where they would cause huge conflict without thinking. And it's not necessarily because they were bad people, but it was more because they just weren't thinking, what's the impact I'm having today on the people around me? And that's what thoughtful means for me.
Okay, so listen, I'm gonna throw you right on the hot seat. You ready?
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna play the role of a prospective coaching client. No, I'll play the role of an actual coaching client, and I'm gonna play dumb to make a point here. Okay, and I'm gonna set this up for our audience by if I worked with you and I said, I want you to do some self-reflection on blank. I think a lot of people would look at me like I have three heads, like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you actually want me to do? Right. So, Ben, here's my question for you. You say you want people to consider the impact of what they're doing. So here's how I'm going to play dumb. Okay, how do I do that? As a leader, how would you like me to consider the impact of what I'm doing?
How would you do that? So I would say, okay, you've got, let's say you've got 5 people in your team. When you communicate with these people, what sort of communication style do you generally use?
What are my choices?
Well, you can, well, okay, let's say what medium you use.
Beautiful. Oh, I love where you went there. Okay. Typically email, it depends. Sometimes I may pick up the phone or do a Zoom or maybe in person if it's applicable, but yeah, more so email.
Okay. And so mostly email, right, but can change depending on the situation. Have you ever had a time where you've actually communicated with your team about how they might want to be communicated with?
I'm going to play along and say, not formally. I mean, we've had really kind of reactive discussions about it, but if you're asking me if I've been intentional about setting expectations or understanding how they're motivated, I would say no.
Okay, and so I'd say, is it possible that some people in your team sort of thrive on different types of communication than others?
Yes.
Okay, and what's the impact, do you think, if you look a bit longer term and you go, okay, what's the impact of me communicating really well with some people and not at all with others in the team?
All right. So Ben, of course, because you're great at what you do, you did it with flying colors. The thing though, I want our listeners to pick up about what Ben did, right, is not only are there so many ways to be thoughtful, but there's so many layers to being thoughtful, right? So Ben talks about what mode of communication, be thoughtful about mode of communication, be thoughtful about how your team wants to be communicated with, feedback, be thoughtful about how they're motivated, how they like to be appreciated, how you lead meetings, how you lead one-on-ones, right, Ben? Like the list goes on and on. I mean, it's right.
Well, I think, and it's important to, I think it's good to acknowledge that some people will naturally be more conscious of what their team are feeling than others. Some people are really tuned in on the relationship side. Other leaders are more results focused and they love hitting the targets. And these are all good things, right? You can't, people focused leaders, and I would consider myself to be one of them. The danger they have is focusing too much on the people, not at the outcomes, because you still need results. I mean, that's why you're in a leadership role. So I was very conscious during my career to start to keep focusing on that, goal setting and targets element. You can't just help your people and focus on them too much. So I'd say that, if it's hard to just say to someone, just be thoughtful. So, which is sort of where I think it's important to motivate. It helps to motivate people when they start to think of the potential impact of not thinking. So if you just go through and do whatever you want to do, because, let's assume that everyone likes communicating the same way that I do, for example, then thinking about getting people to think harder about the impact of what happens if things go wrong, because they haven't really thought about, how they're dealing with people. And I think that's a good way, that can be a good way to motivate people in terms of, okay, I want to avoid that bad thing, so maybe I'll put a little bit more thought into it. And you can almost, in some ways, it comes naturally to some people, but you can sort of, develop checklists and little points where you can, remote working is great for some reasons. You can whack a post-it note on your monitor that says, think about these 3 things today, and you can have that as a visual prompt, you know. So there are ways to sort of get yourself to be more thoughtful without expecting yourself to naturally fall into that pattern, because some people are more thoughtful than others, I would say. And it doesn't make them bad or good leaders. It just means they might have to work harder in some areas.
So Ben, let's go the complete opposite direction. I would imagine it's not uncommon for you to work with leaders that go too far on the thoughtful side, right? Like they're overly thinking and worried. So talk a little bit about that, and what are some pieces of advice and recommendations you make when you have that?
Yeah, so the overthinking thing is a big thing when you're talking about people that, you know, I would categorize as thoughtful leaders, because you can get tied up in, okay, I've got 8 people in my team and I have to communicate with all of them differently, and I have to understand all their preferences. And then after a while, you can't actually do anything because you're paralyzed with all the options that you could use to communicate with each individual team member. And I've got to cater for their special needs. And while that is true to a point, there is definitely too much. You can go too far, where you try to bend over backwards and satisfy every single preference because you're so focused on making them happy. That can be a problem as well. So in terms of the overthinking space, what I generally do is I target, if I'm working with someone who seems to be overthinking, I'll target the areas, and we'll really dig deep into what about this is encouraging you to overthink. So what about this situation is causing you that anxiety or whatever it might be? And often it comes down to things like, well, I feel like if I don't do this thing, then if I don't, you know, let's say someone's a bit prone to micromanagement. If I don't do that, I feel like the quality of the outcome will be no good. I feel like I'll look bad. So it's good. It's good to dig into the detail of the bit that they're overthinking, and then go into, okay, what is it about that situation that makes you feel like you need to control it and think about it so much? And that tends to turn into a different conversation about, okay, well, how can we, you know, not worry so much about the quality of the output and feel relaxed that our team are going to deliver what we need to. And yeah, so it's challenging some of the beliefs as well that people have. One of my favorite coaching questions is, what are the benefits to you of staying the way you are now or not making a change? And people don't think that way normally. They think, well, there's no benefit. I'm in a bad situation and I'm not enjoying myself at all. And you think, well, hold on a minute. If you're not having, let's say you have to have a difficult conversation with your boss, and without that difficult conversation, you are unhappy. So what's the benefit of not having that difficult conversation? Well, the benefit is I don't have to have this uncomfortable conversation, and I feel better because I don't get anxious about it. So that's the benefit that's keeping you staying the same. And then when you start to challenge that benefit and go, well, is that really a benefit? Then people start to go, well, yeah, maybe not, because in the long run, I'm going to be unhappy anyway if I don't have this conversation. That's just an example for you. But that's one of my favorite questions, in terms of people don't usually think there's a benefit to staying the same, but there usually is. And that's why people struggle to change habits and routines and all these sorts of things.
And, you know, in my experience, the word thoughtful is frustrating to a lot of leaders in this context. That I believe thoughtfulness is confused with the phrases high maintenance and walking on eggshells. So if a leader has different people on their team with different personalities, communication styles and motivation styles and all that kind of stuff, you know, I often hear leaders say, oh, I mean, I got to talk this way to this person and I got to do it differently with this person. And it's become like a resentment point. And you know what's funny, Ben? Before I ask you to give your thoughts on it, what's interesting to me about this concept is I do a lot of work in generational communication. And what's fascinating to me about generational communication is it's a simple concept. Every human being is different from one another, right? Doesn't matter what the generation is, we're all still different from one another. But so my point to you is, you know, have you run into any of that, we'll call it, people are high maintenance, I have to walk on eggshells mentality because I have to be thoughtful?
Yeah, definitely. And I sort of I can definitely understand that thinking as well, because there is there's, you know, especially in the last, let's say 20, 30 years, the shift towards people wanting to be happy at work and
Mm,
trying to enjoy their work has got a lot stronger. Oh, but actually the last couple of years it's sort of much stronger because of the pandemic, and people are going, you know what, I want more out of my life now. So I think it's a tricky one, because I can sort of understand where people are coming from, but I think that the best thing to do is, and I would say I would never go almost 100% trying to satisfy every preference of my team, because it's very difficult and time consuming, and your job is to lead as well as help your team, support your team. It's not just to, you know, cater for every whim that they might have. But I think if you can go, 70-80% of the way there and go, okay, everyone, this is how I'm going to communicate with the team. And you have a few different methods in there, maybe to cater for a few different communication styles, let's say. And then you sort of go, you explain the reasons why you can't cater for everything, I think is an important one as well. So if you are acting in a way you think may upset someone, or that's not their normal personal style, I think explaining the context behind that is a very useful thing to do for them, to say, here's why I can't satisfy your exact requirement as well as the whole team, because the whole team is important. And as long as you give that recognition, and your intentions are sort of clear, so your people can see that, oh yeah, you're putting some thought into it. It's not just that you're not having any thought about it at all. I think that's important. But then I think the walking on eggshells thing, you would have seen this a billion times. I have sent the email out, therefore I have communicated, right? And it's like, well, have you? Because has anyone read it, and all those sort of things. It's that sort of thing where I think I think the important thing is to encourage people to think about what is the impact in the longer term of having that sort of blanket behavior that won't suit a lot of your team members because they think differently to you. And I think in the long term, if you unpack it, a lot of it causes huge issues. So yes, I communicated because I sent the email. Was it effective? No. Did it have a big knock-on effect where people came and asked me a million questions because they didn't understand what I was talking about? All these sorts of things. I think there's big ramifications to that. So people think that their life is annoying because they have to cater for the needs of their team. It's usually going to be more annoying if you don't make an effort to do that somewhat, is what I would say.
Well, and I want to expand on what you said. It's not only that I sent the email out and I communicated, it's I had the meeting and I communicated, or I had the one-on-one and I communicated. And Ben, it's so funny. Like one of my favorite things is, let's say you're on my team and you're not hitting your deadlines. And so how does that meeting typically go? The leader sits down and says, so Ben, I just wanted to sit down with you and let you know, you're not really hitting the deadlines and you need to hit the deadlines. And that's the coaching, right? Like, thanks, because
Yeah.
I didn't know I didn't have to hit any deadlines. So thanks for that brilliant insight. So it's such a big point. Like, it's a subtle thing, but there's look, when you're a leader or you're a parent, you sign up for it's work, right? Like, it's work, and there is some follow through, and there is some need to be thoughtful in how to influence situations. So I love that. So Ben, last question is, if you're a coach, theoretically, you're a lifelong learner, right? You value learning. You have intellectual curiosity. I'm not willing to go as far to say everybody who is a coach feels that way. Theoretically, it's how it should be, but that's not necessarily the case. For you, when you look at the great reputation your company has and the success you've had, what do you pinpoint in terms of how you supplement your learning and how you stay sharp and things like that? What are the things you attribute that have really keyed the way to that continuous learning?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the learning thing comes from me from feeling the motivation to keep learning and developing comes from my the want to help my clients get better. So I feel like if I'm not getting better, if I'm not making any effort to develop my skills or learn new things or break habits, or why would they bother? If I don't have new tools and things that I've tried out and techniques, and why would they adopt anything that I tell them is a possible option as well? So I feel like, and the other thing is, if I don't sleep well or eat well or exercise and all these sorts of things, looking after myself, I can't really look after the people I'm working with either. That's a big thing for me, because I know what it's like when I've had a very bad sleep and then I've rocked up at a coaching session and my mind is fried, and it's very difficult to do effective coaching in that state. And so these are things I really focus on. It's about being able to serve the people the best way I can. And so so the to get to what sort of ways do I keep learning, I guess one thing is I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn just seeing what's out there. I must admit I don't read heaps of leadership literature or anything, because like you, I'm a little bit skeptical about some of it when I see I think we've talked about it before. Someone will say, one of the advice in a leadership article is, oh, you should write a strategy. It's like, well, that's cool. That's one bullet point, but I don't know how to write a strategy. So what do I do now, right? And,
That's great.
So, and this is where I guess the one thing I focus on my content is I try to, every time I write an article, I say, okay, so what? So what are they going to do with this thing? Like, what are they going to do with this knowledge? Is there a takeaway here, or is it just me whinging about bad leaders or something? That's not what I want to get out of it. So but in terms of learning, so I do that, just keep an eye on what's out there. So I see a lot of trends and things happening. Lately the psychological safety, huge concept that's been, and it's been around for a while, but it's hugely popular now in terms of people talking about it, writing about it, stuff like that. So I know that's on the tip of everyone's lips. I actually really like mindset stuff, which is awesome because you're a mindset person as well. You love that. Well, your business is called that, so I guess that makes sense. The things like one I found recently, this podcast, the neuroscientist at I think one of the popular universities in the US, and he talks about he collates the research on a certain area, and he says based on how the brain works and the body works, these are some practical ways that you can implement this in your life. So he dumbs down the research, which is quite hard to get through if you didn't have someone doing it for you. And then he goes, and this is why it can be applied, and these are the things you can do. So it might be to improve your sleep or be better at goal setting, whatever it might be. I love that sort of stuff because I feel like that sort of content is not really accessible to the normal person without a huge amount of effort. So this guy does a really good job of that. And these are the things I really like. They're more about, so actually I'd say less about leadership and more about, or less about leadership specifically, more about leading yourself, managing yourself better, managing stress, and dealing with people better, and almost controlling yourself in a better way so that you can show up every day and lead better, as opposed to here's this leadership tool, because there is no leadership tool that I've ever seen that will solve your leadership problems. There are good ones out there. There's good things you can take from all different areas. The real problem I find, and I'm sure you're probably the same, is that, okay, I've got this cool tool. How do I actually use it in my organization? Because, my boss doesn't support me, or my colleagues are not nice to me, or whatever it is, any number of problems. It's actually applying the things that you have, the tools. That's the trick. It's not the tool. The tools are often quite simple. It's actually good at putting it in practice and sticking with it.
Makes sense.
I see this huge, time management is a massive one. Some people, I run some time management training sometimes, and some people come to the course and they go, I want some time management tools. And it's like, well, okay, that's cool. And we have some of those for you, but one of your biggest tools is going to be pushing back on stuff that people ask you to do. And that is not an easy thing to do without practice. Right. And no tool is going to help you do that. That's you being able to behave that way and, have those difficult conversations.
Yeah. All right, Ben, before we sign off, we've got to have you educate our audience on something you taught me in one of our first conversations. Let our listeners know what tall poppy syndrome is.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I think I missed an opportunity there when you were talking about the US versus Australia, because I think this is a little bit of a difference here. Okay, if I'm going to go broad brush, let's talk about stereotypes and things like that. I would say the persona of these. I know the US people is so varied, right? So this is a terrible thing to say, but it's like more outgoing, more sort of brash and confident, and more like if I'm seen as the big celebrity and I'm at the top of my game, everyone's loving it, and so that's a promoted. So more easily promote themselves, I would say, in the US. And that's not to say there's no imposter syndrome and things like that with people, but I would say that's the sort of thing that I perceive as the general perception of things. In Australia, what I've noticed is, and this makes it very hard if you're trying to run your own business, I think, at least getting started, is there's this thing called tall poppy syndrome that you mentioned, that basically the people who rise to the top, like a poppy that's growing above the rest of them, the chopper will come and chop the top of that poppy off so that they're all level. So what in Australia, there's that thing is the tall poppy syndrome describes a situation where people sort of try to drag everyone down to their level. So if someone in Australia goes and big notes themselves and says, I'm the best at this and I'm the best at that, you'll notice it with some of our sporting stars. The ones that really go nuts about I'm the best and I'm going to be the best and I'm going to do this, people in Australia tend to really not like that too much in general. Whereas the people who are humble, so you might have come across, Ash Barty from tennis, she won Wimbledon and all this sort of stuff recently. She is super humble. Like, you would never hear her bragging or saying how good she is, but she's amazing. And people love that in Australia. They love it because she's just like us. Well, actually, she's not. She's like super amazing. But I think that's the tall poppy makes it, so people put themselves out on social media saying I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And there's this thing where people go, oh, come on, mate, don't say that stuff. Don't talk yourself up. That they really resist that. And I'm not saying that doesn't go on in the US as well, but I feel like it's very strong in Australia.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it is funny. Like, I hear you say that. Like, what's interesting, I'm a big sports fan, and when teams tend to win a lot in the US, like the Patriots, people want to bring them down. They don't like it. They like it to a point, but then people get sick of sports. So in sports, there is a little tall poppy syndrome at times.
Yeah,
but in regular, not so much.
Yeah.
So
I heard it described by someone. I was talking to someone in the US a little while ago, where they described it as, there's crabs in a bucket, and one crab, if it makes a break and tries to get to the top of the bucket, other ones will claw at it and try to bring it down. And that's a similar.
Yeah, I like that.
Concept.
I like that.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I think the same thing. Sporting teams in Australia, we like it to be even, and that sort of thing, and don't get too ahead of yourself.
Have you ever been to the Australian Open tennis tournament?
I haven't. No.
Okay.
I'm not a huge tennis fan, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah. Big rugby fan. US rugby is slowly growing in the US.
It is.
And I'm a little bit scared because the US has such a massive population that if they decided one day we want to be really good at this rugby thing, I think they could easily be.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
The good thing is they've got so many sports.
I love it. Well, Ben Brearley, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on ICommunicate. And Ben, if people want to learn more information about you, how to reach you, what's the best way?
I'd say my website's the best way, thoughtfulleader.com, all one word. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So, you can hit me up there and send me a message as well.
All right, Ben. Well, again, thanks for being on the show. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future, and have a great night.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you having me on.
All right. And for ICommunicate, I'm Mark Altman. We'll see you next time.
Okay, welcome to ICommunicate. I am your host, Mark Altman, and as always, thrilled to be here with you to talk about emotionally intelligent communication. Is there a better topic than that? So I got to start out with a quick anecdote that's going to lead us into our topic of the show today. As I've said on the show many times, I am proudly will admit I see a therapist. I've seen a therapist for the last 5 years. This therapist happens to be someone who's a formal trainer in corporate America. So not only is she a therapist, but she actually understands the plight of training and coaching quite well as also. And I say that because, you know, we're in the business of at Mindset Go, our trainers, and we have a guest I'm going to introduce in a moment, but our trainers and coaches, we're basically all day, every day, helping other people through their challenges. So it's nice to have a sounding board and someone to take those challenges to. So I was talking to my therapist a couple of weeks ago, and I don't even remember the context of how this came up in conversation, but I said to my therapist, I said, you know, if I had a magic power, it would be to read people's minds. And without even breaking a pause, she said, geez, if I had a magic power, it would be to read people's hearts. And I thought, wow. I mean, it stopped me in my tracks because, I mean, if you Google read people's minds, you could have hundreds and thousands of articles come up instantly. Go Google read people's hearts. I did it. The only thing that comes up for read people's hearts really is Christian Bible concepts. But as far as like mainstream America, emotional intelligence, it doesn't really come up. And so I thought, what does read people's hearts really mean? And I've given it a lot of thought, and I've talked to a few mentors about it, and I really feel like I've started to piece together what read people's hearts means. So today's show is about reading people's hearts as opposed to reading people's minds. And due to amazing fan demand, Joe Lyman, my partner in crime, an outstanding coach and trainer at Mindset Go, is back. And Joe, and let me just say, before Joe even opens his mouth, I got to say something. This guy's a warrior. I mean, he comes in the studio today, back injury. I mean, this guy could be playing football with his commitment and dedication. So, Joe, I love it, man. I'm so glad to have you back.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I've forgotten all about the pain in my joy of being here.
Oh, great answer. All right, Joe, so let's get right to it. Before we even get into reading people's hearts, we're in the problem-solving business. So why do people crave the ability to read people's minds? What's that all about?
Well, I think part of it is we think if we could read people's minds, it's the mental equivalent of prescribing a pill for a physical ailment. So when we're sick, we don't want a physician to tell us that there's this, long drawn out process. When I hurt my back, I don't want somebody explaining to me about physical therapy. I want drugs, right? I want somebody to give me something that will fix the problem right now. And I think when we say if we could read somebody's mind, then that would solve our need to understand where that individual is coming from. That would solve our predicament of how do we see what this person needs. I can tell you what to do. I can fix you if I can understand your need. If I could read your mind, that would be easy.
Well, so Joe, see, I knew I had the right guest today. So here's the thing when you said, the words that really keep coming to my mind as you're speaking is quick fix, right? And so let's play this out for a minute, Joe. So let's say you're a good friend of mine, which you are. You're a friend of mine, okay? And let's say one day we're hanging out together and your body language, your tone and stuff, it's just not the same. It seems like something's on your mind or bothering you. So now if I have the power to read your mind, I read your mind and you're upset with me. So what's interesting to me about the quick fix is now that I know you're upset with me, then what? Because even if I can read your mind, do I want to have a conversation with you about it? Will I consider you high maintenance and do I have to walk on eggshells around you now that I read? Do you see what I'm saying? So even if you get that quick fix, do you really want to know what's on the other person's mind? Because then you have to deal with it, right?
Well, and that's the crux of the matter, and that's the key to it, right? So we now know what's wrong, but do we have the desire to correct it, particularly if it means that the answer to the question involves self-awareness and self-change?
Yeah, and so do we really want to know the answers? And then not only does it talk about self-awareness and self-change, but it also creates confidence issues because, in the movie What Women Want with Mel Gibson, I think Helen Hunt, if you're at a table with a woman and you can read their mind and the woman doesn't want to be with you anymore, boy, that could really, like if you really knew that out of the gate, that could affect your confidence, right?
And it's interesting. I think that's a good reference because the idea of, in that movie, he literally can read their minds. But it turns out that that's not the power that he thinks that it is. And it turns out that what really allows him to shift results isn't knowing what they want, it's changing what he does. And I think that's the lesson that he learns in the end, is that it always comes back to self-awareness, self-change.
Yeah, I love it. So let's segue to reading people's hearts. And so this is what I want to throw out there to start a conversation, Joe. So when I teach assertive communication, courageous conversations, one of the foundational principles, and you're going to know exactly as I say it what I'm talking about, is there's 3 ways you can understand someone's intent, okay? The first way is if they disappoint you, don't meet your expectations, let you down in some way, shape, or form, you can draw 3 conclusions. Conclusion number 1 is they had negative intent. Conclusion number 2 is, and negative intent, let me expand on that. Negative intent means making it about you. Well, they don't care about what I asked anyway, and they don't want to do what I want anyway, and they're just inconsiderate, rude, or insensitive. That's what I mean about negative intention. So that's option 1. Option 2, which so many people preach, is positive intentions. Go glass half full. Oh, it wasn't about me. They're having a bad day. They're overwhelmed. They're burnt out. Maybe they just had a bad interaction. That's 2. But what we teach at Mindset Go is we want you to do option 3, which is to be curious. And be curious means you can't assume intent either way. If you go in the positive direction, you may be missing something really valuable, because if I sit there and say, Joe's upset, it's not really about me, it may be about me. So if I just default to the positive, you could be missing something. So here's the lead-in, Joe. We teach at Mindset Go so much about external curiosity and internal curiosity. And what I think reading people's hearts is about internal curiosity in trying to understand people's motives and intentions, trying to understand where the behavior stemmed from. Okay, so instead of, I've sent you 3 emails for you to do something for me, and you don't respond, instead of saying, well, that's insensitive and inconsiderate, and they obviously don't respect what I need, I wonder why. I wonder why they're not. What's driving that behavior? What are the motives, intentions? So that's my feeling, Joe, about the first step in reading people's hearts, internal curiosity to understand people's motives and intentions.
And I think that's the key, first of all, because it starts with desire, right? Your desire isn't to just resolve the situation. Your desire isn't to ignore the situation. Your desire is to explore the situation, and that's the curiosity that drives that. So without that, the steps that follow are limited to the 2 that you suggested. Either it's, excuse me, you make it about yourself, or you say, well, it's okay, it's about them and I don't have to worry about it. But both of those are so limiting in terms of what they allow you for options to proceed and how you get to a good place for all the people involved.
Here, Joe, and it's interesting, you use the term limiting options. And what strikes me, and I don't know why this has come about, but we know the expression, people who make things black and white. And in my experience, so many people, when they're evaluating their options, often only see two options, when I find there's almost always three options. And the best example to illustrate that is you can handle things three ways: assertively, aggressively, or passively. You could also be passive-aggressive for anybody who's sitting there saying, I forgot that. But let's take the core three for the moment. So if you and I have an interaction, and every time when I say every time, let's say, how about the last 3 times we've spoken, I've interpreted that you become kind of rude and sensitive to me when we talk. So the typical person will say, well, I'm going to tell them how I feel, because they're not going to talk to me like that. I'm not going to let them talk to me like that. And so depending on how you communicate your hurt, your anger, your frustration, that can often be aggressive, right? Passive is, I don't want to deal with it. I'm not going to talk about it and then avoid it. And people forget that third option of assertive communication. And assertive is communicating your feelings, but in a respectful and kind way. And that's kind of the marriage of where you want to be, right?
Well, exactly, because it takes the other person into consideration, whereas the other two opportunities to respond are just about you, the speaker. And anytime that's the case, again, you're just automatically limiting yourself and what's possible.
And Joe, here's what I want to talk about when we come back from the first break. I want you to think about this for a minute, and our listeners as well. When we're trying to understand someone's motivation, intent, what caused something, if it's a deep-rooted issue, say it's because of their family culture growing up, say it's, from a past job, they had a boss that was very belligerent or tough. If we were to go that level of internal curiosity, are we, by being empathetic and reading people's hearts, is that soft leadership? Is that, enabling by saying, oh, well, so we're supposed to be okay with this behavior because their family culture sucked, or, they didn't have role models or mentors or templates to be successful? When we come back for our next break, we're going to talk about just that. For Joe Lyman, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. I'm here with the esteemed Joe Lyman, and I'm Mark Altman. And Joe, I got to just tell you before we get back into this, sometimes people call me sir, and I feel like it's so uncomfortable when people call me sir. I feel like I'm old. Do you feel like when people call you sir, does it make you feel old?
Yes. Yeah, I tell him my dad was sir.
I mean, if I was in England and I was being knighted like Sir Elton John, I'd be okay.
I'd be cool with that.
I'd be really. I would love that.
I'd be like, go Queen.
Right? So, okay. So one of the things before we get into the topic, as we went into break, I want to bring up is Joe brought up the point when we were talking about there's usually 3 choices instead of 2, and assertive, aggressive, passive. He was talking about how people tend to limit their thought process and their options. And one of the points I made when Joe and I were in the break, and I want Joe to speak to, is it's almost like the hockey analogy, right? Guy punches you, and then you punch back, but you get the penalty. You're the one caught. But you feel entitled to punch back because you got punched, so it doesn't feel fair. In conflict and in relationships, when you feel wronged by somebody or someone hasn't met your expectations, the third choice of being assertive, even if you recognize that you had that option, you were mindful of it, you may feel like I don't have to use that option because I was wronged. And there's an entitlement there, Joe.
There absolutely is. And the idea is that there are 3 ways to look at something. One is impersonal, but that's cold and distant and doesn't involve human kindness. The other one is to take things personally, but that's when you start to discount the other in the communication, right? You hurt me first, so now I can respond however I choose to. But there's a third option that's available to people, and this is to see things in a non-personal way. And when I say non-personal, I mean recognizing that people act the way they feel. So when somebody lashes out, it's not because they're in a happy place, it's because they're in a very dark place. And it's not your job to fix anybody, nor are we able to, but it's your job to recognize that people don't get angry with you because of you. You know, in customer service training, we explain this to customer service people. The customer that's screaming in your face wouldn't even know your name if you weren't wearing a name tag.
That's great.
It's not personal.
Yeah.
But we choose, and I want to be very clear on this, we make a conscious, intentional choice to take things personally that we do not have to.
So great example, Joe. So if when you're reading people's hearts and you're understanding their intentions and motivations, if you are self-aware enough in that moment to even be able to theorize the potential root reasons that a person may be acting the way they are, which is a huge stretch for a lot of people, because this would require, first of all, Joe just wronged me. Now I have to articulate, first of all, I have to recognize there's a change in my mood, my energy, my emotion. Okay, so I'm not happy. And I'm not happy because of what Joe did, quote unquote, right? That's what I'm going to tell myself often in that moment. And it's not accurate in almost all cases like Joe just alluded to. So in that moment, let's say I go over, listen everybody to the hills you have to climb in emotional intelligence. First, you have to recognize you're upset. Then you have to recognize why you're upset. Then you have to recognize it's not about me. Don't personalize it. Let's assume you get through those 3 steps, which are huge, right? It sounds so easy when I just say them like that. Now, you've passed those 3 steps. Now you're on step 4. You're reading people's hearts. I wonder what that was all about. Why would they do that? What would motivate that behavior? What would cause someone to do something like that? So let's assume you did that well, Joe. Now you're on step 4. Now you get to step 5, which is, what are the possibilities? And Joe, the possibilities that drive people's behaviors are endless, right?
Absolutely.
But I want to talk about specifically family culture and previous company culture and existing company culture. All 3 of those would be high on my list as potential contributors to what would drive people's behavior.
Well, you're spot on. There's a quote from W. Edwards Deming, the fabulous gentleman who created the community of quality, and anything related to quality in manufacturing and in the business world is a result of Deming's teachings. And he said that a bad system will defeat a good man every single time. And this is, I mean, and what you've just described, and part of the awareness that you want to develop is that it isn't necessarily our job as a participant in this conversation as to understand and cure the difficulty the individual is having, right? As you said, the reasons are limitless. But it's our job to recognize that they're there, that for whatever reasons, and then as it relates directly to a leadership situation, you know, you used a term a little bit ago. You said, is this soft leadership? I would say it's leadership. Forget the soft. This is just what a good leader does, is to recognize what in our culture, in the framework that this individual has found themselves in, where their performance is suffering or their situation is clearly not what they would like it to be, it's our job to self-reflect and to reflect on what are the contributions our organization is making to this problem. So if we have a culture that drives people to distraction and we're the leader of that culture, it's our job to understand that and make necessary changes.
Yeah, I love that, Joe. And so I want to build on what you just said, and I want to give an example, Joe. So let's take a situation. Joe's going to do some problem solving for our audience here. So let's take a situation where you've got a leader and a team member. The leader has spoken to a team member 3 times about a performance issue. And by the 3rd time, the leader is in the mode of, they're not remembering it takes 2 to tango. They're not remembering what their role may be and why we're having a 3rd conversation. It's about the employee doesn't care, the employee doesn't value work ethic, pride in their job, et cetera, et cetera. So now the leader goes into that conversation, and if the leader in that conversation, even at a third conversation, is empathetic and tries to read their heart and what is motivating this behavior, why they're not doing what's being asked, what's soft about that? Like, I don't understand how that is, because we're still holding the person accountable in the conversation. We're not letting them off the hook, but we're reading their heart first. We're trying to empathize with what is causing this behavior. Isn't it, like you just said, isn't that great leadership? Why would that be construed as soft leadership?
Because we've arrived at a point in our culture, in the broader Western culture, when paying attention to emotions has only recently begun to be understood as a strength and not a weakness. I mean, how long did we hear companies tell employees, managers, frontline employees, leave your emotions at the door, right? Don't bring your emotions into work. But from my perspective, when somebody says leave your emotions at the door, you've just told the people that work for you to leave their enthusiasm at the door, to leave their joy at the door, to leave their energy at the door, because those are all manifestations of our emotional situation. So when somebody says leave your emotions outside, you're telling them to leave outside all of the things that make them a vital contributor to your workforce.
Well, and I'll say this, Joe. I agree with everything you said, and I'm going to tell you what's even worse. If it's possible to stymie someone's emotions, energy, enthusiasm, what's even worse is you're basically stopping feedback. You're stopping assertiveness and self-advocacy. So when you look around at the Great Resignation and you're like, why are people leaving? They don't feel fulfilled. They're not passionate about their job. They don't feel respected, appreciated, recognized, whatever. It starts there, because if I don't feel like I can speak up for what I want and need, and I need to suppress my emotions, I sure as heck don't want to work for you.
No, and that's the short version of what we see happening everywhere today. I mean, they call it the Great Resignation. You can call it anything you want, but the number of people who leave a job is still more than 4 million people a month for the last 6 months. And when we're seeing numbers like that, when you're in that situation, something has changed, something has shifted. And when you're standing there, how was it that Buckley described it? Standing athwart, saying stop to history. It doesn't work.
Well, and by the way, Joe, you bring up a really interesting point. I'm going to digress for a moment because it relates. So many people are leaving their job, yet so many employers, despite all the additional labor on the market, it's still really hard to find people right now, which is really an odd dichotomy, right? Because you think, now I will say this, and I want to get your opinion on this, Joe. What's interesting to me about that is I think the reason that's happening is because people are actually self-reflecting in this transition period more than they ever have. And they're trying to evaluate, what do I really want in my career? How do I really want to spend their time? And I think it's that.
Well, I think we could do an entire show on what you're describing. And think about this for a moment. The Generation Z folks who came of age, so Generation Z is born roughly between 1995 and 2012. So these are folks that are coming into the workforce in large numbers at this moment. They came of age when corporations and businesses in 2007 and 2008 during the economic downturn were so fast to say, hey, there's been an economic crisis, 500 of you don't work here anymore. Hey, there's been an economic crisis, we need to lay off 75 people. And they saw that. And it has never once occurred to these people, as they now mature, finish their education, and move into the workforce, that they owe anything to an employer that brings them on. Not one thing. Because they watch their families, their friends' families, lose jobs, lose houses, lose livelihoods as a result of companies simply, you may argue that they were simply responding to economic necessity. But the bottom line is they saw that there was no loyalty from the organization to the employee. And now as they enter the workforce as employees, they have no concept whatsoever of loyalty to a company that will ditch them at the earliest possible moment of need. And frankly, I think they've simply accepted reality. They're not cold-hearted, ruthless people. They're just noticing that companies are no longer loyal to employees.
Yeah, Joe, thanks. That's a phenomenal point. And we'll be right back, everybody, for our next segment of iCommunicate. For Joe Lyman, I'm Mark Altman. Okay, welcome back to iCommunicate. And I have to challenge our listeners. I mean, you tell me where you can find a podcast or a radio show that's talking about reading people's hearts. I mean, we're really tackling the major issues going on in the human race, Joe, right?
Damn Skippy.
All right. Hey, we love Skippy. All right. So, Joe, you are someone that, loves powerful quotes and expressions and things like that. And I read something somewhere the other day, and I've been teaching leaders this since. And it so fits into our conversation the other day. Now, keep in mind, Joe, this expression is a phrase that is supposed to depict why it makes sense to be thoughtful, to have internal curiosity, external curiosity. Ready for this? I'm going to be selfishly disappointed if you've heard this before. I'm just saying. The phrase is, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice.
Ooh.
Have you heard that
First of
before?
all, I haven't heard it before. And second of all, I think it is spot on.
Right? The second I heard it, I'm like, oh, that's human relationship interaction to a T.
Absolutely.
Right? And so we talked earlier today a little bit about three conversations, and I deal with this with leaders all the time, and I know, Joe, you do as well. The reason why you may be having a third conversation is you diagnosed the wrong problem, right? And so, or you didn't even take the time to diagnose it, period, for that matter. Right?
Yeah, and there's a key, because there's a phrase that goes along with that I share with the participants when I'm talking about leadership, which is kind of like the mechanical version of that. Ready, fire, aim. We know there's a problem, so we immediately do something, and then we check to see if what we did was actually the thing that was going to fix the problem we were experiencing. Because getting something done is important, but it's exactly that. It's prescription without diagnosis.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Joe, I want to get back to reading people's hearts, and I know you have really powerful thoughts to share. So, you had mentioned to me previously that reading people's hearts is like reading a book, and I wanted you to expound on that a bit.
So, some of our listeners may be familiar with a method of book reading, and it's called SQ3R. And for years, it was taught in elementary schools and junior highs. And the premise behind it, each of those SQ3Rs, stands for survey, question, read, recite, review. And the premise was that you would survey the book. Let's say you're going to pick up a book and read it. You'd look first at the introduction, if it had one. You'd look at all the chapters and the chapter headings and the titles. You'd look if there were subheadings in each of the chapters that you were going to go through. And then you'd ask the question, what is it I might get out of this chapter? What is it that I'm looking to get out of this reading? And then after reading it, after going through and reading it, then you would recite to yourself, what is it that this chapter was trying to show me? What is it that I was able to glean from this chapter? And then review the entire process once again. And I think we can take the idea of SQ3R and implement it when we're talking about having a conversation with somebody. So it gets to what I call the 3 Ps. Plan, prepare, and practice. So our plan is, hey, I'm going to have a conversation with Mark because it seems to me like the last few conversations we've been having didn't really go in the direction and end the way that I anticipated. And I'd like to learn a little bit more about it. And my question is, maybe there's something that and here's the key when we're talking about reading people's hearts. Not asking the question, maybe there's something wrong with him that I need to know about, but totally turn that off and say, is there anything in this conversation, is there anything in this relationship that I'm doing that I'm missing, how it's having a negative impact on the person that I'm speaking with?
Yeah, and so, wow, great stuff, Joe. And I think what's going through my head as I'm listening to you is the word accountability. And It's funny, Joe, like sometimes companies will call me up and say, Mark, we need you to come in and work with our leadership team to be more accountable. And I always laugh. My response is, oh, I'm sure they're going to be really excited for that training. So I'm going to walk in and so everybody, I'm here because you all need to be a little bit more accountable. Like that's going to go over really well. So my point is that and I wrote it down as you were saying, you said, instead of maybe there's something wrong with him or her that I need to know, it's, is there anything in this relationship that I'm doing that's causing a negative impact? And accountability has to be two ways, right? When we hold someone accountable, it implies to me that it's a one-sided exchange. So if you're not coming into work on time repeatedly, I need to hold you accountable because you're not coming into work on time. Yet, why are you not coming into work on time? It's not that you don't know the rules. You know you're supposed to be on time for work. There may be something going on. Maybe the way I'm treating you is causing you to be a little passive aggressive and show up late for work. Maybe you're showing up late for work because you feel, hey, I go to the end of the wall for these people. I work a long time. So if I need to show up for work late, then they can deal with it because I'm a really valuable employee to the company. So my point is that if you're being accountable, when you hold someone accountable, it's not, I'm perfect, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. You have to be held accountable. It's what Joe said, which is, what do I need to be accountable for in this relationship, in these exchanges, and what do they need to be accountable for?
Well, and again, that's spot on. And asking the question, am I holding everyone accountable in the same way for being here timely? Right? Do I say that frontline employees must be on time, punch a clock, and yet executives or management or leaders or supervisors come in kind of willy-nilly whenever they'd like to, and no one seems to have a problem with that? And all too often, I see companies that don't deal with, I won't say they treat people differently, but they don't deal with minor infractions in the same way with frontline folks that they deal with folks that are higher up in the echelon.
Well, the irony to what you're saying is one of the strategies I give leaders when they're faced with an unfair situation, like you're describing, someone wants more time off, someone's not coming in on time, someone wants to work more from home than in person. We see that all the time now, right? Is I actually teach leaders to use reverse empathy. So Joe, tell me what you think of this strategy. Okay, seriously.
Absolutely.
So what I will coach leaders on is I will say, so if I'm going to role play this. So Joe's the person who is the only one on my team coming in late. So to Joe's earlier point, everybody's being treated fairly. So that's the premise. Okay, just so you know, that's the premise. So Joe's the one that's coming in late. Joe's the one that's asking for more work from home time than everybody else. And so I go to that conversation and I say, Joe, here's my challenge. My challenge is that we are a culture of fairness and inclusivity. It is really important to treat everybody the same way. Would you agree? And let's just say for the premise, they agree.
Absolutely.
Okay? And then I say, so here's my challenge. If I allow you to set precedents, such as working more from home, coming in late, then what do I tell the rest of the team? And if you have some advice for me, Joe, in how to handle that situation, I'm all ears. But until then, we have to treat everybody the same way.
I think that's an exceptionally good way to go.
Are you just being nice to me?
No, and I'm going to tell you why. Because my comment, if that were to happen to me, and in fact, in a similar manner, it actually did happen to me many years ago when I was working directly for an organization, and they said to me, well, you've asked for 4 weeks of unpaid time off, which was my request, and they said, first of all, what if everybody did that? We have to treat everybody the same, and second of all, no one's ever asked that before. So my thought was, well, if no one has ever asked for it before, then it's clearly a one-off, excuse me, and we can work something out. But if I suddenly cause a tidal wave of people looking for a month of unpaid time off, then wouldn't it really be in the best interest of this organization to sit and chat with everybody that wanted that time off and develop an equitable plan so that we could continue to treat everybody fairly, exactly as you've described the situation right now? But that means that I have to be thinking and curious and willing to compromise as well. And I love that it's a turnover to the employee, because it should be a turnover to the employee. We expect people to communicate exactly as you say on a two-way street. And if I'm just asking or demanding special treatment, that's not okay. If you're refusing because you've never acceded to a request like this before, that's not okay either. So what we can do is say, okay, is this a one-off? Is there anybody else looking for what you're looking for? Is there anybody else looking for more time, more work from home? Which, of course, nowadays that's become, companies still don't know what to do with people that want to work from home. You've got, not to pick on Generation Z once more, but you've got people that graduated college in March of 2020, May of 2020, were hired on a Zoom interview and have never been to the building where they work before for 2 years, and now you'd like them to commute 90 minutes each way, and they're looking askance on that proposition.
And so here's the other flip side of reading people's hearts, and we're going to finish the show with this today, and I'm going to tease our next segment. Here's the flip side. The flip side is when you're reading people's hearts, we talked about the term soft leadership or enabling before. When you're discerning people's motives and intentions, I got news for everybody. Sometimes they're not all that honorable. Like sometimes they're selfish. So this is not, hey, just give people the benefit of the doubt to try to understand their motives and intentions. And an example is, and we're going to talk about this coming out of the break, Joe, I'm working with a lot of companies on the challenge of, so you're changing the policies, people are coming back to work. And of course, what most employees are saying is, why do I have to come back? I'm more productive. Gas prices are high. I don't want to commute. It's wear and tear. It creates to the burnout, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So employees are making these impassioned arguments that why they shouldn't. And what we're going to talk about is that is not, in my opinion, okay, when you're trying to understand motives and intentions, to me, the expectation was set before the pandemic that you're supposed to go to work. Now, if the company decides to change a policy and pull everybody together, kind of like Joe was alluding to, that's a different story. But when we come back, I'm going to talk about to the point that how do you see both sides of that argument? How do you bridge the gap between I feel I'm more productive from home, I'm happier at home, in conjunction with the expectation's always been to come to work? So for Joe Lyman, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. I am your host, Mark Altman, and I'm here with my esteemed colleague, Joe Lyman. And Joe, let's get right to it. We talked heading into the break about this conundrum, reading people's hearts. Are their motives unselfish, or do they have negative intentions with their motives? It's not always clean. And we use the example of the challenge of bringing people back to the office. And look, are people more productive working from home? In most cases, probably yes. Are there less distractions? I'm going to say it's iffy. And I'm not even talking about kids and family members. Let's be honest, people. If you're telling me there's less distraction, you're telling me your phone isn't buzzing every minute, you don't have sound distractions that are still dark, because I'm a little skeptical that it's that, all right? So, but possibly. So the question is, before you took this job, the expectation, when you took this job, pre-pandemic, the expectation was you're coming to the office. Pandemic happens, you're working from home. So now when people are pulling you back to the workplace and saying, hey, that was the expectation all along, and people are being resistant, and I'm encouraging our listeners here, don't read anything into this, because you may be assuming my opinion on this and you may not be right. I am simply making the point that I'm all about expectations and articulating them and being clear on them and agreeing on them. And Joe, I'll lead to you by saying, we were talking at the break and I said, man, pre-pandemic, if employers said you could take Fridays only and work from home or have half days on Fridays, people would have been tickled pink. And now it feels like a loss. It feels like a disappointment if that's all you have.
Well, and I think you've nailed it. And here's part of the problem. Pre-pandemic, employees in many instances were literally begging employers to let them work from home for a day or 2 days a week. And employers, here's the real problem. Employers were so reluctant to see this develop that they just said it can't happen. And then 15 minutes later, COVID, and all of a sudden it could happen. And employees felt that employers might have been a little bit one-sided and a little bit blinded to the possibilities. I'm not saying employers were disingenuous. I'm saying they didn't open up to the possibilities. And suddenly, it was possible for me to work 5 days from home. And now they're saying, okay, now that I've proved this, let's keep doing it. And employers are like, we're going to need you to come back. But I think what employees sometimes miss is that it is possible to be very productive from home. Let's concede that right at the get-go.
Yep.
But at the same time, that's working on what exists in front of us right now. But that's not what keeps companies moving forward into the future. What keeps companies moving forward into the future is developing what's going to happen next in the workplace, developing what the needs of the folks in the workplace are going to be and how to meet them. And that happens on a different and significantly better degree when individuals are in person, face-to-face with each other.
Well, and here's the challenge, Joe. You know, I'm not a fan of companies that have rules and policies just because. Nor am I a fan of when organizations treat this issue in a parental fashion. That doesn't feel appropriate or right. And see, this is why I wanted to finish with this today. Reading people's hearts is about blending both sides, right? And so from the company's perspective, and to Joe's point, there's a lot of value in collaboration, a lot. There is a lot of value in interacting with humans in person together for lots of reasons. And the employees who don't want to come back to work may not see that value, or they may not want to see that value because they're thinking about themselves and selfishly. But at the end of the day, to keep people engaged, appreciated, motivated, it's how do you understand an employee's needs? And we're not just talking about working from home. We're talking in general here.
Absolutely.
How do you understand, how do you read an employee's heart? How do you understand what's going to make them feel motivated, recognized, appreciated, what's going to drive future actions from that employee? And at the same time, marry that with the culture you're trying to create at the company, with the policies that you have in place for reasons. It's blending that, right, Joe?
Absolutely. And one of the things, and here's one of the reasons to come back and be face-to-face, right? And let's get into the science, of how the brain works. Mirror neurons. If you're doing something that makes you happy, it turns on different parts of your brain. And what we know from functional MRIs is that if I'm sitting next to you and I'm experiencing what you're doing, the exact same part of my brain lights up the same way. It's called mirror neurons. It's part of what the insular cortex does. This is what regulates emotion and keeps homeostasis so that we're in balance. But this is part of the physiology of being next to a person, like literally physically in the same room with them. They've done studies that show that if there are two people who are in a good mood and somebody who's in a bad mood walks in, says nothing, sits down next to them, that the mood in the other two people will begin to shift and worsen.
Joe, can you imagine calling up an executive, like a C-suite executive, and this is how the conversation goes. The executive says, Joe, thanks for calling me back. We are having some issues with employee satisfaction and engagement. And listeners, listen to what I'm saying. And Joe says, yeah, you just need to do a better job activating their mirror neurons. Now, can you imagine the reaction Joe would get? And here's the point I'm trying to make. sometimes some of the easiest solutions, or the most obvious solutions, are the best ones. And so, yes, if Joe used that language, they'd probably hang up on him because they wouldn't know what the heck he's talking about. But he's right. You know, when those mirror neurons get activated and you're happy and they trigger other neurons, then those people are more likely to take initiative, come up with ingenious ideas, be more productive in their work, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have a productivity, engagement, and satisfaction problem, and it's because people aren't happy, how do we get people happy? Like, it's not brain surgery. Like, how do we get people happy so those mirror neurons can get activated?
Well, and that's the key. To come back to Dr. Deming again, the man who invented the idea that you have to measure things to make improvements in the process said that the most important elements in any organization cannot be measured. And one of those is the happiness of people. And I think he was correct, but I also think that we now have engagement surveys that can help shed light on things for us, that can help move us in a good direction, that can help us say, hey, what's important to you? What matters to you? And part of this is it's a new world for many organizations, right? If you look at the genesis of modern management, it wasn't how to make happier employees. It was how to build better robots. And I don't mean robots in the literal sense in machines. I mean how to turn humans into better working automatons. And that was the function of management in the early days, going back to Frederick Taylor. But the process of management today has to be, how do we create happier employees? And if that sounds like soft leadership, well, then I would just point to the fact that under every set of circumstances, happier employees are more productive. So if greater productivity is relevant to an organization, they might want to rethink how they achieve that.
Well, the irony is you've really pulled our show full circle, because I find it's very hard to, aside from surveys, it can be very hard to measure the happiness. But you know what's not hard to know is when they're not happy.
Oh, yeah.
So isn't that interesting? It's so funny to know why people, it's so much easier to notice when people aren't happy than when they are. And that's back to reading people's hearts. It's where we started on the show today. If people aren't happy, read their heart, understand. And look, the last thing I want to share on the show before we sign off today is this. When people ask, what does Mindset do? What do Mark Altman and Joe Lyman and our other coaches do to help people? You know, the foundational answer I give now is we help make people emotionally intelligent communicators. And it's the marriage of emotional intelligence and conversational intelligence. So if you have challenges in your company related to reading people's hearts, understanding what's driving their intentions, their motives, how to make people happy, how to manage emotions for yourself and others, right? Call us, email us, info@mindsetgo.com. The number is 978-793-1159. And Joe, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Mark, as always, the pleasure is mine.
And I want to tell you, I'm going to bring Joe back. When we get off the show today, we're going to do I already know the topic, Joe. You ready for this?
Tell me.
So we're going to tease the listeners when you come back. The topic is going to be thoughtfulness versus work, fun, and responsibilities. In other words, budgeting time for thoughtfulness when you have those competing against you. So that's what we're going to talk about when we come back. And Joe, I gotta as our last topic today, I gotta say this. You know I'm a big Star Wars guy, and tonight's a big night. But I'm DVR. Well, it's on Disney Plus, and I'm going to the Celtics game, so it's not going to watch it tonight. But Obi-Wan Kenobi is starting on Disney Plus tonight, and I got to tell you, talk about emotional intelligence. Star Wars is all about emotional intelligence. So Obi-Wan Kenobi. Talk to me.
There's no downside to watching Star Wars movies. If your children haven't seen them, they should watch them. If you haven't seen them all, even some that people will tell you you shouldn't have to watch, you should watch all of them.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, Joe, final parting shots. Thanks again for being on the show. Just a final thought about reading people's hearts before we wrap up.
The bottom line is there is no pill. Right? We started out by saying we want the pill to fix people. There is no pill. What there is the opportunity to be curious. is the opportunity to try to understand what is motivating the people around you in your organization and help them achieve their goals. Because in the end, a leader recognizes that the goal of the leader isn't to be individually successful. The goal of the leader is to help other people achieve their individual goals.
Awesome. Joe, thanks again. For Joe Lyman, I'm Mark Altman. Have an emotionally intelligent day. We'll see you next time.